Welcome to Curiousaholic, the show where we question the past and imagine the future. In today's episode, we spoke with Vivien Sieber, who is the author of Kino and Kinder, A Family's Journey in the Shadow of the Holocaust. The book primarily discusses her family's history and difficult times throughout the Holocaust. The book primarily discusses her grandmother's experience throughout this time, how she had a business in Vienna, and how the Nazis basically took over the business. And also we talk about the Kindertransport, where her grandmother participated in relocating some kids throughout the war and providing them with a better life. We also talk about the current affairs and the current war between Israel and Hamas. We ask her opinion on the war and talk about what kind of impacts it has had on Jewish and Palestinian communities.
So yeah, hope you guys enjoy this episode. Leave a comment on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, and all other major streaming platforms where we are. It really helps us grow the show and make better content for you guys. So if you also have a personal story that you want to share or an expert in a particular field and would like to get on our show, you can send us an email at curiousaholic@gmail.com. So without further ado, here is Vivien Sieber.
So Vivien, as someone who's researched their family history in great detail, a lot of which your history was, part of a very nefarious time, would you say that in our current times, we have learned from the lessons of our past?
I'm not sure we've learned all that much from the lessons of the past, given what's happening at the moment. I think what I learned from looking at my family, and particularly looking at the Kinder, who came over and my grandmother cared for, was how they all managed to produce really positive lives. And that they went on, having had very difficult childhoods, leaving your parents when you're tiny and moving into an institution in a different country, different language, completely different education system. And yet they mostly went on and formed relationships, had families, had worked, often in caring professions and education. So I think that was a positive, that even if you've had horrible disturbances, you can make good in the end.
You kind of touched on, the transport there, the Kindertransport. Can you explain how your family was involved in like the Kino Palace and the Kindertransport, and what kind of impact it had, you think, on the world at that time?
Well, the Kindertransport scheme started incredibly quickly after Kristallnacht. It's now called the November Pogrom, or the Night of Broken Glass, when essentially National Socialists rampaged across Germany and Austria, smashing synagogues and Jewish businesses. Within 3 weeks, rescued the first train carrying unaccompanied children. The whole of the Kindertransport scheme was unaccompanied children, generally aged between about 4 and 16, something 15. And their parents or a family member would take them to a mainline station, and they would get the famous luggage labels put around their necks, and they were brought across by strangers. And they traveled across Germany or Austria or wherever, Holland, and then the sea, and they arrived in Britain. Now, these children had no idea where they were going. And some ended up in hostels, some ended up in family homes, some were exploited. And in the case of my grandmother, she was a refugee herself. She arrived in Britain in December 1938. And yet by January, she was on her way to Newcastle, to Tynemouth, to be matron in a hostel for children brought over on the Kindertransport. It was a group of friends in Newcastle who decided that they must do something to help these children. There was a very informal committee. There are no minutes or anything like that. But they did appeal to the local synagogues, that the local rabbis asked for support. And the different villages supported in different ways. Some did subscriptions, some did bigger fundraising. And you have to remember, it was very poor then. The whole of the Northeast was there was a lack of work and a lot of poverty. And these girls arrived. Most of them were taken to Liverpool Street Station in London, and then, if there was no one to escort them, they were put on a train to Newcastle and collected by one of the matrons and taken to the hostel. Now, those children didn't know that Liverpool Street Station, which is a London mainline train station, they thought they'd gone to Liverpool. They didn't know what Newcastle was. And they didn't know if they were going to safety or they were being lured into some sort of terrible death. And what I haven't been able to find out is quite how many children there were. It's certainly over 25. It may be as many. Some came for long periods, some came for very short periods, particularly before the war started. Some parents managed to escape, or other family members came and got them. Some moved into other places. So I just don't know the answer to that. But there was certainly 25 there throughout the war.
Okay.
Well, so we want to learn a little bit more about you and your family. Can you tell us a little bit about, the Sieber family, your grandmother a little bit, who she was as a person, and, how she, she was able to, bring a lot of joy to some of these children and all?
Well, my grandmother was very tiny, very beautiful and very charming. And she basically persuaded her family. She was born in Brno, which is Czechoslovakia now. It was then the capital of Moravia. Her family were drapers. And she persuaded them that what she really needed to do was have a cinema in Vienna. And obviously, we don't quite know how she persuaded them to sell a shop and buy the cinema. But she and her sister moved to Vienna in 1914, 1915. And started running the Palace Kino. Now, she'd already had a disastrous marriage and one son who was back in Brno, and she'd divorced. And she and her sister Zalma ran the cinema. It was a great success. She was the public face. She chose the films and the music and things like that. Zalma seems to have checked the toilet paper was there and sold the tickets and, ordered the coal. And then along came my grandfather, and they were very happy. So along came my dad. And then tragically, he was killed in a road traffic accident. So they were actually only together for 5.5 years, maybe 6 years. And so she worked in cinema throughout. When she was widowed, she went on working in the cinema and caring for her 2 sons. And of course, anti-Semitism started in Germany in the 30s, and it did impact across the border into Austria. Though in Austria, it was somewhat more sudden because basically the Germans simply invaded. It's called the Anschluss. Part of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War, Germany was not allowed to annex Austria. But by 1938, they just marched in, really. And grandmother's flat was really smart. It overlooks the Ringstrasse. And so she and my dad actually were sort of hidden in the windows, watched Hitler's triumphal march into Vienna, which must have been completely terrifying.
Oh, yeah.
But she recognized very quickly that she'd have to send her son to safety. His elder brother was already in London, so she sent Peter to his brother. Peter was literally 2 weeks over 17 when he made the journey across Europe on his own.
Wow.
Oh, really?
And she then organized trying to escape herself, which was much harder because Peter had money. The money was paid when my grandfather died in the car crash. He was innocent. So compensation was paid to my dad for while he was at school or in education. That money had never been used, so that paid his exit tax. My grandmother didn't have that sort of money. Her asset was the cinema, which was a going business. Her sister, Zalma, had just been widowed, didn't want to leave, couldn't think about doing anything. So she had to leave the cinema for Zalma to live off. But anyway, the Nazis confiscated it incredibly quickly. So by then they were earning less than they had to pay the staff. The flat was rented, so although the rent was low, there was no value there, and every other Jew in Vienna was trying to sell furniture. So eventually, she appealed to a former lover to give her some money, which I think must have been very, very hard for an independent woman. And he'd asked her to marry him, and she said no. Being married twice was plenty. But he sent money. He also sent money to my dad in London, and she managed to escape. But I think it was very, very hard because she had to queue for exit permits. And I remember her telling me how she was allowed to take the contents of one room, but she said that officers just came in and smashed her china. It was in tea chests, and they just put rifle butts into the chest. And so she was pretty penniless when she got to England.
Wow.
She discovered that her elder son, who'd said, "Oh, Streatham is lovely. It's not quite London. It's not quite a village, and the streets aren't quite paved with gold, but we're really doing well." But of course, by the time she arrived, he'd lost his job as a salesperson for an Austrian engineering firm because it had been taken over and was making armaments. And so the flat was already pretty full because it had my dad in it. So she looked for work as quickly as possible. And meanwhile, she used to go to the public library and learnt English. She learnt 10 or 20 words a day, and her sons tested her because she spoke no English when she arrived. And yet within 6 months, she wrote really good English to my dad. And, she was writing to my dad in English.
Wow.
Interesting.
And then she got the job in Newcastle, where, so she went and lived there. And then when the heavy bombing started, the hostel had to move to the Lake District, to Windermere.
I just want to ask, was it difficult for a lot of the people there to escape? Was it related to how much money you basically had to have an exit out of the Nazi-occupied territories?
I think one of my grandmother's great regrets was that she failed to persuade any other member of her family to leave. They all had good reasons to stay. Now, you had to show that you'd paid all your tax. And the exit tax kept going up, and they wanted more. You had to show you'd got visas to come in. You had to get a visa to cross Germany if you wanted to go to Britain from Austria. And these only had very limited time spans. So if you ran out of if the time ran out on one while you were getting the others, you had to start again. At first, the Nazis really didn't mind too much if Jews left, provided they left with nothing.
I see.
This was quite early on. This was 1938. So people did escape. People did actually manage to get out of concentration camps. Some were bought out. Some left on illegal boats going generally to Palestine. It's the terrible boat crossings we have now coming to Europe were going the other way then. In terms of if you were rich, did you get out? And if you were poor, did you not? I don't know the answer to that. I don't think that necessarily is a correlation, but I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just want to go back on something you said earlier. You talked about there was one night in particular when, the Nazis kind of marched into Austria, and, there was a lot in the book you described, there was a lot of glass shattering. Can you talk about that night? What do you know about it? Because I found it really interesting. I don't remember exactly the name of it, but there was a night in the book where you mentioned kind of they walked in and there was a lot of chaos happening, a lot of glass shattering, and a lot of people were under fear. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, there's two different things. One was the Anschluss, when the Nazis march across the border, across Austria and into Vienna. I mean, there are videos showing Hitler in the Heldenplatz, which is the sort of one of the big main squares, making speeches. And my dad left manuscripts and journals, and he described the Vienna just going wild. People were being beaten up. and worse than beaten up, taken away. And of course, people were terrified. So some committed suicide as well.
Mm-hmm.
Then
Wow,
you've got the Kristallnacht, where you've got this. It's concentrated. It went on for a few days. It's now considered a pogrom. And again, they smashed synagogues. They fired synagogues. They smashed the fronts of Jewish shops. And they wrote Jude on them, and they beat people up and killed people and took some people away. So there are sort of two distinct, if you like, time stamps on this. You've got in Germany it was rather different because the Nazis and anti-Semitism was a sort of gradual process that carried on over 5-8 years, and so conditions for Jews just got worse. Whereas in Austria you had this really sudden break. One thing is that it's not. I think from my research, it's quite clear that conditions were deteriorating. You've got sort of strange spin-offs because Austria actually had a film industry and made some quite big films in the 30s. Of course, their main market was Germany because of the language. But as soon as the Nazis said that they wouldn't buy any film that was made with anybody Jewish involved, that meant that the Jewish actors tended to move, or the famous ones could move relatively easily. Some went to the States, some went to other parts of Europe. But the film crew and all the other people, the supporting people, of course, they lost their work. And so, again, my grandmother's cinema suffered because it could then only really buy German films.
Yeah, I remember that part specifically in the book. It's interesting.
Okay. So from what I understand there, when the Nazis came into Austria, so they did give a chance to some of the Jewish people to leave in the beginning, early days, without any wealth, basically. But it was more as it went on that they put a gripe on them. And is it later on that they decided more and more to basically exterminate the Jewish population?
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The concentration camps, they started out they were repurposed. The early ones were in a way repurposed from other sorts of camps. The extermination camps came much later, or a bit later, particularly once they had this conference and came to the idea of the final solution, which was to eradicate Jews.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that you bring up, the distinction between how Nazism grew in Germany versus Austria, because I think a lot of people, when they think about the Nazis, they think about a lot of this was focused in Germany, but there's also Austria, and you talked about the very rapid radicalization of the population and just like the ideology of the time. So it's interesting to see the distinction between both countries.
But there's also Czechoslovakia, and then they invaded Poland and moved east. And things got more and more gruesome as they moved east.
Yeah.
What was like their initial goal of the Nazis with the Jewish population? Was it to get them rid of their wealth and just make them less and less powerful? What were they?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
They certainly seem to want to take all the wealth. It's in some ways it's inexplicable. Or I don't know. They clearly wanted to have a Jew-free state.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess in the beginning they started with less, maybe violent. I may say, well, it was still pretty violent, but I guess they couldn't full on, justify the extermination. It's as they moved on and occupied the territories that they that they justified. I think that's the terrifying thing about this. It's how it can slowly start with hate against a certain group and then turn into a justification for.
But you have to remember, it wasn't just Jews. There were the Gypsies, the Roma and Sinti. There were the disabled.
True.
There was anybody. There were homosexuals and there were communists. So yes, the Jews were a target, but there were other targets as well that were just as.
I think because of their ideology of the Aryan
sort
people
of master race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of like a higher race. Exactly.
The sort of perfection, which you can see why people who are differently abled might and Negroes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of different groups were targeted, of course, like
because
a little
they were
needlessly
seen
here.
as lower class. And,
yeah.
That's
unfortunate for us.
So we want to ask you, can you explain what kind of generational trauma or scars this genocide has left on you and your family?
That's a really difficult question in some ways. Obviously, I had a rather strange childhood because my grandmother lived in this enclave of European ladies who were refugees, who spoke this very strange sort of mixture of English, German, Hungarian, a sort of polyglot, and they all had very strong accents. And yet they all seemed to be able to understand each other. And they cried a lot. And you don't know as a child that that's not normal. So we got used to having really nice cakes and things like that. It's taken me a very long time to sort of even begin to understand how appalling it must have been for my grandmother. I knew she was angry, and she was angry that she never got her cinema back. She got the cinema back, but she didn't get all the money for it. She was upset and angry and guilty that she'd survived when the others hadn't. I think that's something she never really articulated very clearly. And what is remarkable is how little she said about some things. Now, mine was it's quite a noisy, talkative family. And so she would tell me wonderful things about the cinema and going to balls and things like that. She never really said very much about her sister Zalma, though they must have been close. And she said incredibly little about her brothers, and when they all died assortedly in concentration camps. Her brothers mostly died in Auschwitz. Zalma died in Theresienstadt in the ghetto.
Wow.
And she just didn't really talk about that at all. My father took a very robust view. That he had done well. He came over. He was 17. He got a place for refugees at Newcastle, and did a degree in electrical engineering. Halfway through his first year, he was interned because he was an enemy alien, sent to the Isle of Man, and then sent to Canada. Came back from Canada, finished his degree, and was then the first enemy alien to serve in the Royal Navy and then Naval Intelligence. Now, he said here it's now very the internment is very contentious because people were imprisoned without any trial. And his view was that it was a mistake, it was a waste of time, but he didn't hold anything against the British. And in fact, in some ways, he gained hugely because the internees organized themselves incredibly quickly into sharing their knowledge and understanding. So there were university teachers were doing lecturing. There were even school children who were, the older students were teaching the kids. And Peter had this amazing liberal education, and I'd never understood really where he got it from until I found journals that he kept, wartime journals, and he got that during internment. And I think he clearly greatly respected the Navy, but his view was that if it hadn't been for Britain, he would never have been alive. And so he was grateful for that. I think my grandmother's view is the same. So the trauma there was he'd already been traumatized by the loss of his father. The thing that he really wanted, because he was 5 when his dad died, he always wanted to find out about his dad, and of course he had no family left to tell him. So what I do remember as a teenager was people would suddenly appear from the other side of the globe, quite South America, or one came from the States, and what he wanted to know about was his father more than talk about the war in some ways. So in terms of what happened to me was, well, yes, I had a very confused childhood and spent I couldn't possibly have thought about doing the book or anything like that while I still had a day job. I didn't have the headspace. To some extent, the book was because I more or less promised Peter I'd do it, because he was always disappointed that his manuscripts hadn't been published. Yes, so I think I'm probably as muddled as everyone else, really.
Yeah, so of course, with this kind of thing, like the trauma transcends generation to generation. Like we could clearly see that, you had to go through some of these, horrific memories, even though you weren't even born during that time, really. And it's just really, clear that, it transcends generations, I think.
Well, one thing that to some extent I started working out, I started sort of trying to find out what had actually happened. Because I'm trained as a scientist, so I drew a family tree, and as I started drawing the family tree, I realized there were more people on the tree than I'd ever known about. There was a great aunt that I just hadn't, I'd never heard about her really. And as I worked out, found out more about these people, they went from being like names to becoming personalities, or people that, where I actually began to care about them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, say, Great Aunt Selma, because I have these photographs, I have these sort of packets of old photographs. Some of them were really, really amazing. And so, I could see when I found the pictures of Zelma, she actually looked remarkably like my younger sister when she was a child, or when she was a young woman. And that became far more upsetting in a way than the bald facts.
Yeah, I see. So you were kind of putting the story behind all the names you had heard, right? Just by digging into the family tree and okay,
very much so.
Okay, so is that what inspired you to write this book? Is it just the your curiosity and your interest and what they had to go through?
Well, it was partly because it was probably curiosity that got me started. Turning it into a book was partly because as a way of using Peter's materials, and partly because I find writing quite easy. So it was a way of, it began as a sort of framework and just grew into a book.
Yeah, so in a way, it's like to honor his request there to get those published.
Yes, I mean,
Okay.
he wrote a report. What he did was just before he died, and that's 90, just before millennium, he contacted as many of the girls as he could, the Kinder that he could, because he really wanted to acknowledge the committee who'd paid for and run the hostel. And so I to some extent I helped him a little bit with that. But he left when he died. I found this folder with these amazingly writing to him about their memories. They were incredibly moving and very personal. So after all, I'd known about the Kinder all my life, because tea at grandmother's, they would write to grandmother, and the letters would get read out, or we'd get shown the photographs. And so many of them were names that I'd always known, and some I'd already met. After he died, I was lucky enough to meet more, and they've been very, very generous telling me what it was like. And so that to some extent, I wanted to tell their stories as well. Obviously, the people who set up and ran the hostel. So you end up with lots of different stories all in one go.
I know there are a lot of passages in the book of, them recalling their own stories as well.
Yes. One thing that surprises me is how matter of fact they are about it, and the sort of common sense that Elfie in particular, well, yes, the matrons had sons, they were not used to girls, and they didn't know how unpleasant teenage girls could be. And, they just basically got on with it. Because they didn't really have there wasn't really, I suppose if you think about it, there wasn't that much alternative. Either you got on with it or you don't.
Yeah, that was their reality, right? I mean, like you're talking about, like it was like matter of fact to them, but those were the conditions, and I guess they had to kind of go through it and just try to survive, basically.
Yes, there's one thing is they're all very, very nice about the food in the hostel because the matron was a famous cook. And one of the girls actually said, well, it didn't matter if the cheese was dry and crumbly, but we were always well fed. This is wartime, there's rationing.
Yeah, that's
most
interesting.
people weren't particularly well fed then.
So they were grateful for whatever support they received. Yeah.
It's really there's a big distinction. Some of them, like Elfie said, look, they were secondhand clothes, they were cast me downs, but they were beautiful quality. Others said, oh, we had those dreary cast down clothes. Well, no one had new clothes during the war. But some were more positive than others.
Okay.
So that's just describing different people.
Yeah, it's interesting, the different perspectives, right? I guess everyone copes with trauma and anything else differently from one another, right?
Yes, I don't think all of them coped not all of them coped as well as some. Some were
exactly.
very bitter. Others, just the one I speak to most is Inga, who's 90 and lives in Wimbledon, which is South London. And she said, look, she'd been too busy living. What we would find surprising is how young these children were when they were just, cast into the world. And so the hostel closed. She was the youngest child there. She was 5.5 when she arrived. And so when the hostel closed in 1947, she was sent to a hostel in Manchester with her sister, and they were very unhappy. They'd gone from a very small village school to a much bigger, rougher school. And then they went to Israel, and then Inga came back, and she said, look, I was working. I had to make a job. I had to support myself. And, it's only been recently, I think, that she's been bothered by people like me and the BBC and has been revisiting it.
During that time, they didn't really have time to contemplate on it or think about it much. They just had to move on with life and try to make, a living and support themselves. And
yes, because one girl was, she was actually the only non-German speaker to arrive. She was Czech. And so poor child arrives in England and she can't speak either German or English. So she can't really talk to anybody. I don't think my grandmother actually spoke. That surprised me. But I don't think my grandmother actually spoke very much Czech, I've decided. She was 14 at the end of the war. They basically moved her from the hostels to just by the time she'd learnt English, they then moved her to another hostel in Wales where it's for Czech children. But of course, she'd forgotten her Czech by then. And at 14, she was living independently in London. They're paying her an allowance, and she's renting a room and working.
Wow.
Which
That's such a young age.
Yeah, well, to us, that would be extraordinary.
Yeah.
It would, yeah. You couldn't imagine. Yeah, some of the things these kids went through at such a young age would be unimaginable for today's kids because, we have so much, privilege and we're spoiled so much here that it's difficult to imagine
There's
the
one
hard
clear
times.
pattern that the younger children seem to have coped better than the older children because the older children, after all, came from loving, supportive families. You've got to be very loving to send your child away like that. whereas the younger children couldn't remember their families. So because there's both being separated from your parents and moving to an institutional life, which, I'm sure two women in their 50s coping with 25 girls. They had no domestic help, so all the work was shared out.
Mm-hmm.
And the girls all learned to cook, all learned to cook and things like that, which are very useful. But it must have been quite hard. No central heating. They had to collect the fuel.
Yeah, it wasn't an easy task to care for all these kids.
Just recently, we had an interview with a Vietnam War veteran, and it was just so shocking to hear how young these soldiers were, and it's like you can't imagine what they had to like overcome at such a young age, right? And it kind of draws a parallel here, right? That all these, you mentioned the girl that had a job at 14. It's ridiculous to think that, where you have to adapt and you have no choice.
Just no choice to mature fast.
Yeah,
well, 14 was the school leaving age then. Because there was an issue for the girls in the hostel, because the committee had to fund everything. They had to get the money for medicines and health, because we didn't have the NHS only appeared after the war. They had to clothe them, feed them, heat them, everything, rent. Elfie said that she wanted to work in a bank, but of course she left school at 14, and so she didn't have school leaving certificate. And that the teachers actually taught her in the evenings. They gave up their own time to coach her so she could get the qualification. And after the war, she went to university and read English and became an English teacher. So the one thing the local papers show, particularly in Tynemouth, how very interesting this hostel and these strange people are. And they covered the establishing the hostel and they're preparing it, and they interview the matrons, and then they interview the girls, and they interview the girls' headmaster, who, after all, he's coping with an influx of girls who don't speak English, just amalgamating them in his ordinary classroom, and he's very sensibly divides the girls up and pairs them with his normal pupils. So you have a group of English children with one refugee, and he's actually saying, well, they're picking it up very, very quickly, and the hostel girls are writing essays in English really quickly, and I think sometimes the difference between the two education systems starts showing. So they were all really good at maths, probably better than the English children. And they were probably better at structuring essays, even if their written language wasn't that good at that stage. And they never played team games.
Why?
So they didn't do that in Germany.
Huh. Interesting.
So the whole concept of team games was a complete shock to them.
Oh, really? Okay.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, so you could see that, the lives in these hostels, it was clearly different and it could be very precarious. And yeah, a lot of these people just had to overcome and try to push through life, I guess, right?
I mean, I think the matrons did lots of very nice things for the girls. My grandmother arranged free cinema once a week for their language. And they had free swimming, and the Tynemouth, there was an open air pool. It's still sort of, you can see the remnants. They're about to restore it. And they had free swimming. And every child had their own birthday cake made, which, bearing in mind there was rationing, but they all had a special cake made every birthday. Now that's 30 cakes a year.
Yeah.
That's almost one a week.
That's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, those little gestures, I guess, really, made a difference.
They showed that they cared.
Yeah.
The empathy.
Yes, I think they tried really hard, and I think some of the members of the committee would come over and read to them and play with them.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So just to understand, these kids in these hostels, so they didn't have their parents, right? Their parents were left behind. They just came there alone. Were they adopted eventually? Or they just independently went through their life, or what happened to these kids as they grew up there? Like, did they just build their own lives, or did they?
Yeah, they
Yeah,
built new lives.
yeah.
One married a GI and went to America. One married a fellow. Elfie married a fellow student at London University. Um, they built lives, and many had families. So many have got children and grandchildren, and they've spread across the world very, very markedly. So some went to Israel and stayed. Some, like Inga, came back. Some went to South Africa. One went to South Africa and then moved to Australia, and several ended up in the States. And one ended up 10 miles down the road in the Lake District.
I see. Okay, so they each carved their own path, which
Yes,
is
and when my dad wrote to them asking what had happened to them and about their lives, to be fair, one wrote back and said it was so horrible she doesn't want to think about it ever again.
Wow.
But most of them were really positive.
that's
Yeah,
great.
that's great.
But
Yeah.
they were very sensible and most of them recognized the limitations. That there were the two matrons, and it was a war, and there was rationing, and it could have been worse, sort of thing.
They did the best that they can.
Yes.
And we can definitely thank the matrons there, that helped these kids to have a life.
Because one thing is they stayed in touch, mostly, and so they had a reunion in the 80s when I think about 15 of them came to London, and they all sort of met up. And I think they have supported each other at a distance for a very long time. I think one thing was very clear was how sensitive to each other's needs they were. So the things like letters from their parents. Now, when war was declared, the matrons clearly had a complete fit. They were terrified themselves and said, look, you must destroy anything in German, and you mustn't speak German outside the house. Now, Annie, who was in America, said, well, that really wasn't very sensible, because it was quite clear from their accents they were foreign. And letters from parents were so important, the kids didn't destroy them. They hid them, they kept them under their pillows. And I think that the girls, when something happened, I think the girls were sensitive to how awful it must be for the other.
Mm-hmm.
Or even how there's one child whose both her parents survived. Her dad was in England throughout the war because he was in the army, and her mother survived, was a rare survivor in a concentration camp. And at the end of the war, she's taken to Sweden to recuperate. And what shocked me was how long it took. She was in Sweden for nearly 18 months. Because, of course, they didn't have induced comas and perinatal feeding or anything. It must have been very hard nursing someone who was that starved. But anyway, she ends up back in Britain. But when the telegram arrived saying that her mother had survived, this child says, well, how can I face the others? I've got two parents, and most of them have got none.
Mm-hmm. So is that why you think they stayed in touch all these years? Well, like, why do you think that? Like they did stay in touch?
I mean, some school kids, some school friends, I'm still in touch with some of the people I was at school with, right, very distantly, and not in that way. I suspect they shared a lot, and they had a lot in common. So yes, they did. I mean, there have obviously been squabbles between them as well.
Yeah,
No,
I'm sure.
Like any
yeah,
other. Yeah,
like living in a community, right? Like there's bound to be little skirmishes and things happening
I
inside
meant
there.
actually
Yeah.
more recently at a distance, where perhaps communications are harder.
Okay. I see.
Okay. Yeah, no, fascinating. what we wanted to segue into from all we've learned now with this history of the kids and your grandmother is in today's day and age, would you say that the Jewish community has obtained some semblance of peace and been dignified after all that happened?
I'm not sure I'm competent to comment on that, really. I think that there is something that is in there that we're all, that even if you're not an active part of a Jewish community, but there's something underneath all that comes back, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is like trauma that will always kind of resurface.
There's an echo.
Yeah.
There's an echo. Yeah. Okay. And as we know, in the current state of affairs right now, where there's, unfortunately a war that's breaking out in Israel and the Hamas group in Palestine, them aside, because we know it's the leaders of those two parties there that are fighting together, what would your message be to the Jewish community and the Palestinian communities? Mainly the innocent people who just want to lead normal lives and have that peace.
They want to be allowed to live normal lives. I from a distance, it looks as though the community in Israel is self-fractured, because you got the very right-wing government and Netanyahu, who has made things an awful lot worse. So, as with all right wing, we've just been suffering from nothing like as extreme, but in Britain we've just had some fairly right wing government, and conditions for ordinary people do not get better. And what one hopes for is a long term solution to Israel and Palestine that recognises that both have the right to exist. I mean, certainly, I'd never really. It was only when I started reading some of the letters. These are letters that were written maybe in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s from family members, or between family members, and the sort of sudden realization of the importance of somewhere that they could call to home and safe, even though they might consider themselves Austrians. As anti-Semitism started, the sort of, I know Zionism started earlier, but the urge to go to Palestine for security, I could see why, with all the horrors developing in Germany and Austria, why you might want to think of somewhere else as home. But I might have been naive, being late thinking that. In terms of Israel, you've got another British colonial mess up in some ways, where yes, let's just divide the population, just let them walk around like they did in India, irrespective of killing vast numbers of people and plunging them into total poverty. You've now got a very difficult situation where you've got two groups who have perfect, reasonable rights to live in the same space.
Yeah.
And nobody seems to be trying to facilitate that. I think that at the moment, all everyone's trying to do is stop it spreading to the rest of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to provoke a bigger, conflict and to involve more countries, I guess. There is always that fear, I think, right? Do you think, this war could lead to something like a bigger war involving more countries? What do you think on that?
I think it could easily become a bigger war. It's causing tensions here in Britain, where very reasonably there have been some quite big pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and our right-wing government is yes. Hamas is a terrorist organization. It's a killing machine, but most Palestinians are not Hamas. Whereas we have a very, very right-wing Home Secretary who's trying to stamp on everyone.
Yeah, it's important to dissociate, right? The Palestinian people with Hamas, like these groups are not the same. They're, Hamas, like it says it's acting upon like for the Palestinian people, but really, like I don't think they are, right? They're just
They have
causing
their own
terror.
goals, and
Yeah, they have their own goals.
But they
Right?
haven't
that's-
had an election for a long time either. So they don't really have a mandate.
Yeah.
so they're like forcibly then kind of
Yes, I mean
staying in power.
they're I mean, unfortunately, the electoral system in Israel isn't ideal either.
Yeah, because their prime minister Netanyahu has been there for a while. I'm not sure how long again.
It's something like
he's been
13 years on and
there.
off.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
quite a bit there, and they're pretty far right with their some of their ideologies.
Yeah, and I have a question about, Israel. So Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye will make the world blind. This situation between Israel, Palestine, these nations are very powerful nations. How do you think they should approach this war? Should they approach this with prudence and care, not to invoke more suffering?
But I would like to see a ceasefire and try to negotiate a way out of it. The best would be some sort of negotiated settlement. I did read in the Guardian today that there are people in Israel calling for Netanyahu to go for two reasons. One, that he has just been presided over the biggest massacre of Jews in Israel's ever known. Total failure of security, and the other because he's probably got them into the situation in the first place. If there was a much more moderate Israeli government, and the trouble is the Palestinians don't really have anyone to speak with their voice. Hopefully Biden and others will carry on trying to mediate and calm things down.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Possibly
hopefully
not very successfully.
Yeah. Hopefully some interventions from other countries could, calm things down without causing more havoc as well, right? Because we got to be careful to draw that line, right? If like other countries jump in, we want
Or they support one side versus
it has to
the
be
other.
done peacefully,
But
essentially.
there is the United Nations who should be doing. This is the sort of job the United Nations should be trying
that's what
to
I.
do. But they haven't actually done it for a very long time.
I definitely agree, and what I want to bring upon on that point is in situations like this, when a country gets attacked and viciously like this, so what Hamas has done, obviously their leaders are gonna react very emotionally because I'm looking at this from far away, and of course, if someone did something to my family, my judgment and my decisions will be very different to what should be done for a long-term peace. So I always ask myself, where is the United Nation, this organization that we have that should be kind of this neutral ground that can be like, we should calm down and try to figure out a way to not escalate this even further.
Yes, no, I think that the problem is you've had so many years of this really unhappy situation where the poorer Palestinians have been exploited, in a very, very small territory. And the coexistence, everyone seems to assume that the coexistence was all right. Well, it clearly wasn't. And Hamas have been able to exploit that.
Yeah.
I think there's now a logistic problem for Israel. If you've got tunnels and people hidden in civilian population, that makes it much, much harder. But I think it's very important that we remember that the whole concept of genocide came out of the Holocaust. And the whole concept of the Geneva Convention, and again, it was a Holocaust thing. And these are crimes against humanity, some of them. Certainly killing innocent people in an unprovoked attack is clearly genocide and a crime against humanity. Whether it was totally unprovoked, if you sort of sit in Israel lobbing things at your neighbors all the time, that is provocation, even if it's not large scale. The same goes for Hamas, who were busy lobbing things back. or who were lobbing things. But one thing would mean when that hospital was tragically hit, and there's this instant explosion: did Israel do it or did Hamas do it? If you asked someone like the United Nations to say, "All right, come in and tell us what happened," because the evidence will be there. If to someone on the ground who's an expert would be able to work it out, rather than saying, "Oh, you did it." Well, actually, no, let's stop. Let's see actually what the evidence tells us. That would be, it would give the United Nations a much more proactive role.
I agree. Yeah, yeah. Because a lot of the headlines also that I see is always saying Israel says this or Israel military
pointing
force.
fingers, right?
No, I mean like they're saying always what Israel is saying, or Hamas is saying this, or they're saying this, but there isn't sort of like an independent or third party investigation into figuring out
if
the
you
evidence.
actually could find out what had happened. I mean, I think from what we're seeing here, it does look as though it was a Hamas unexploded rocket. And, there's bits of evidence that seem quite sensible. But we shouldn't be relying on, the press to pick it apart. We should have a much more independent, authoritative body.
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be very useful, and given the circumstances, for sure. And like you said, right, it's not like one particular group is to blame here. I think both sides were oppressed, and maybe a third party would kind of be able to regulate things and sort everything out.
The problem is, I think it's probably a much wider set of conflicts that does go back a long way, because it would be very easy for the rest of the Middle East to sort of suddenly explode.
Yeah, of course.
And you've got some. I thought when Biden said to "don't be consumed by rage" like we were after the bombing, that was very wise. But it's not clear who's pulling whose strings, and I don't think it ever will be. Not from certainly not from here and just sort of watching the news.
It's difficult. It's difficult to piece together, what the truth is at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue, right? It's been going on for years, and that's kind of why I think, like, tying it back to World War II and understanding the Holocaust as well, it all kind of ties in, I think, somehow.
I think it goes back much earlier. That it goes back to the fall of the Ottoman Empire, when you've got the Ottoman Empire. This is the end of the First World War, as you're talking about 1819. When they decided they would chop these countries up, that you've also got, so some went to France, some went to Britain, and of course the Brits offered the same piece of land to two groups, which isn't good. But you've also got another change, which is that you've got the move from you've got a move from Bedouin and mobile communities that don't have the fixed base to moving into cities and things, and massive overcrowding. I mean, Gaza does seem to be hugely overcrowded, even if it had all the services it needs. So you've got an awful lot of societal changes over the last century.
Yeah, Gaza is very, very densely populated from what I've seen, like the images and videos. It's even if they had everything they needed, I find it's very overcrowded.
Yeah. So I kind of want to go back and, make another parallel here with your grandmother and kind of World War II. So your grandmother Paula showed a lot of empathy towards, some of the kids being transported from Nazi-occupied territories into hostels. So how do you think we stop the cycle of violence that's, being perpetrated right now?
Well, I think one thing that is very sad is that we've got much better at killing people. Warfare is, you've got drones, who don't even involve people killing people. You've got the whole of technology guiding things. So you can kill a lot of people quickly, and that I think it possibly dehumanizes it. It's some of the numbers that we've heard in the last 2 weeks have been enormous, and we don't really understand what those enormous numbers mean. There've been some very brilliant ideas of trying to explain to school children how many people were killed in the Holocaust, because it's a vast number that you can't really cope with. And there was a button project in America where they collected up enough buttons and put them in jam jars, just looked at what sort of volume those buttons took. And that gave a way of sort of seeing what people, what might give a way of understanding what the people were, how many people were killed. Now, I think what we've not reacted to that much in the last couple of weeks is the vast numbers that they suddenly announced. Oh well, they died. So that's partly just because technology's got better. I don't think we've got any nicer, and you've got the whole question of information. One thing that's changed, of course, is the pictures come out very quickly. Now, what was very clear from talking to the girls was how important photographs were. And I gave a talk in a school, and they were going, well, where did you get the photographs from? And I said, well, people went to studios and had pictures taken, or there were photographers in the street. It's because the school kids don't actually know what a camera is. They're just used to using phones. But in the last war, or in 1938, there was no mobile phones, there was no internet, so information took much longer to come. I mean, in terms of hours and days and hours rather than instant. And I suspect there was propaganda. We know that the Nazis used a lot of propaganda and pulse radio programs and things here. But I don't think that it's the problem of the internet and polarization that you do get. And the speed that things can become quite nasty on the web.
So from what I understand, it's almost like, like you said, people haven't really gotten nicer. It's evolved into a modern, with a modern technology. And I guess, now that different nations have become really strong, that has maybe been a deterrent from, having one nation trying to, take over the world or eradicate a group of people. But there is still conflicts of this sort that happens, and sometimes it does just boggle my mind why is it so difficult to reach an agreement on peace. But again, it's just so complex, and there's so much history, and also revenge, just simply revenge that each side wants to take upon the other. Yeah. And it's like, when is it going to be, where a side is going to say enough is enough?
Also, I just want to reiterate something you said about technology. Right now, with like increasing information like the availability online, we don't even know which is true or what part of it is misinformation. So there is a lot of fear and a lot of fear mongering happening there, and I think technology definitely exacerbates the problem a little bit here.
Yeah.
I think the problem is, until people actually say, well, it's quite all right to be different, and that, I respect you even though you've got completely different origins to mine, people are still going to argue about racial origins and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it's not just Israel. There are lots of other not so little skirmishes going on at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
You've got Ukraine, you've got a lot in Africa, where you've got different tribes, if you like.
We don't hear about that often. The ones in Africa, they're barely talked about.
Mm-hmm. So you've got, Sunni against, another group. It's historically, it's gone on forever almost.
Yeah. It's
there's always war, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's just entrenched in our society. My other question was gonna be, I feel like the answer might be no, but with Israel and Palestine, ever find peace? Do you think there is such a possibility, even though it seems unattainable right now? From what it seems like we went back 50 years from this attack that happened. But could there ever be, and what would need to change?
I hope so. I think we all hope that there'll be some form of permanent solution. Um, it it's it's not tenable to go on sort of trying to kill each other.
No.
So yes, though I don't know what it is. I think it's again. I think it's going to take some sort of arbitration.
Yeah, some kind of reform and some kind of, just change, right? Radical change here.
Radical, yeah, exactly. Do you think religious beliefs have a lot to do with this also? Because there's a lot involved with the religious sites there. And the Hamas groups likes to use Islam, but we know that Islam and most Muslims aren't the extremists that are portrayed, especially in the media and whatnot. But do you think that the religious beliefs have a lot of influence and push towards this sort of violence?
Well, personally, I do. I think that you unfortunately you've had wars between different types of Christians or different types of Muslims for and less perhaps different sorts of Jews. Though they do separate themselves. I've always had them, and I mean what is so horrible is that it's all essentially if it's all essentially all stemming from the same monotheistic belief. It's just split off at different times, and why it's tragic that people can't see that. But
Yeah,
of course,
yeah,
I've
that's
now
the thing.
offended every Christian and Jew and Muslim. Um,
No, you didn't. No, we understand your point. You're
Yeah.
saying,
That they share
Yeah.
more similarities than
yeah, a lot of
many
exactly. A lot of
differences.
people are fighting, with their religious beliefs, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of religions portray the same values, and everyone is trying to, believe in a God that would, bring them peace, really.
Yeah.
Right.
They have different names or different prophets. Well, except for Judaism, but yeah, it's almost as like if the religion is about finding peace and making yeah,
Joy in the world.
joy
really.
and
Yeah.
reduce conflict, it almost seems like it's doing the opposite, where it's pushing people to take a side and then us versus them mentality.
let's sit in my box, if you like, and my box is better than your box. And yes, I think that's really sad.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot for our human species to evolve. Just as a whole, as a society, I think we still have a long way to go. Just to finally wrap this up, as a final question, to tie back to your grandmother. So, out of all the hardships and difficulty that your grandmother has endured, what is the most important thing that she has imparted onto you?
Oh, survival! That you work hard and you'll get on, and that you you have to try. And I mean, I think that that she was 54 when she came to England from a very affluent, hardworking but affluent background to nothing, and yet she had to she picked herself up and worked her way to sort of supporting herself for the rest of her life. So I think that was a very useful lesson.
Yeah, that's a great message.
That's a great.
I think the world needs to hear that right now.
Yeah, definitely. No, well, Vivien, we thank you very much, for coming on and sharing your research into your history and also giving your thoughts on the current state of affairs. So before we close this off, can you share where people can find you and buy your book if they want to know more about the history
But
of your family?
you can buy Kino and Kinder in any decent bookshop, but they can order it. You can get it from Amazon or Book Depository. So virtually wherever you get the books, you should be able to get it. And it looks like that. So that's
There's the
actually
cover.
grandmother.
Yes.
And there is a website, viviensieber.eu, which has got more about the book. It's got some pictures, and it's got a contact. So if people do want to contact me, that's the best way to go.
Wonderful.
Sounds great. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. We appreciate your insight on all this.
Yeah.
Thank you for interviewing me. That was lovely.
It was great. Great discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much.